Hello, welcome to the second episode of Sounding Places, Listening Places, a Radio ArtEZ podcast series in which we explore the relationship between sound and our environment. My name is Joep Christenhusz. In contemporary Western culture, we seem to have lost an intimate connection with our surroundings. More often than not, we think of our environment as a passive backdrop in which humankind can take center stage, controlling the landscape, developing infrastructures, and extracting resources at will. However, as recent ecological crises like climate change, the dramatic loss of biodiversity, and large-scale destructions of habitats are pointing out, this anthropocentric position has become unviable. If we wish to develop a more sustainable future, we urgently need to reconnect to our environment and restore a more reciprocal relationship with the Earth. In this podcast series, we inquire if sound and listening can help us to do so. In our last episode, we have been exploring these questions with regard to the natural sound world. In this second podcast, we'll take a closer listen at the urban soundscape, which has been a lifelong interest of our first guest.
Yeah, my name's Peter Cusack. I'm British. I was born in London, and for most of my life I've been a musician, sound artist, a teacher in the world of sound, particularly sound art, and a field recordist.
From early on, Cusack's interest in field recording and sound art have been going hand in hand with a fascination for the environment and for questions of ecology.
I started that interest when I was quite young because I was an obsessive bird watcher, and I learnt to recognise many birds by their song, and that has stayed with me. And one of my main reasons for wanting to become a field recordist was originally to record bird song. My first recording was made in Holland. Actually, I was a student at the Institute of Sonology, which in the 70s was in Utrecht. And they had a portable recorder. It was my first access to a portable recorder. So I made my first recordings in Holland. In fact, I made an LP, vinyl record called After Being in Holland for 2 years, which came out on the Bead label in London. The last track on side B is a straight wildlife recording from Holland. It's an oyster catcher, I think a schoolekster in Dutch, flying overhead and calling very loudly.
While listening closely to the schoolekster recording, you may have noticed many more sounds in the background.
As soon as you try and record birds, you realise that you also are recording aeroplanes, people, traffic noise, all the other sounds that are constantly around. And in fact, the bird is likely to be the quietest of all of those. So there's instantly you become aware of the whole soundscape, not just the first thing that you might be interested in. And so my own interests were broadened out very quickly.
Before long, Cusack's interests broadened from individual sounds to the soundscapes of entire environments. Particularly, the urban soundscape has been a recurring field of interest in his work.
Well, it's where I live. I mean, I don't think you can really do sound except through listening and experiencing it. And since I spent almost the whole of my life living in cities, It's the urban soundscape that is my world. Of course, I've been outside cities and travelled a lot to very rural places too. But the vast amount, most of my life has actually been in urban areas, and that's what I hear all the time, every day, 24 hours a day. So I don't think it's a big surprise that should feature so strongly in my work.
In his ongoing Favorite Sound series, for example, Cusack invites city residents to record, share and describe aspects of their everyday urban sound environment. A central question of the project is to figure out how inhabitants of large cities experience their local soundscape, thereby highlighting positive aspects rather than emphasizing noise pollution. Through the years, Cusack's Favorite Sounds project has been organized in many cities worldwide, ranging from Birmingham to Beijing and from Prague to New York City. However, its first edition took place in London in 1998, making the Favorite Sounds project one of the earliest collaborative sound mapping projects.
In 1998, the London Musicians Collective set up a radio station called Resonance FM, which still continues to this day. And me, along with many other people involved, wanted to think of an idea for a radio program. So my idea was to concentrate on the soundscape of London. And it occurred to me to ask as many people, what is your favourite sound of London? And then I would go out and make recordings, and the radio program would be constructed from those recordings. And I was overwhelmed by the interest. It was completely a surprise to me that people would be so interested in such a question. And I also wrote to every single British member of Parliament from London. I think there are between 70 and 80 of them, and even got 9 replies from them. One of the MPs, for example, suggested his favourite sound was the rehearsing of the military bands in Whitehall. Whitehall is the political centre of London, where Buckingham Palace and Houses of Parliament are. And there's a big kind of ceremonial military presence with brass bands. Well, because he was MP, he would daily hear them practicing, and that was his favourite sound of London. And another one I particularly liked was if there are canals in London, and along the edge of the canals there are paths where people cycle or walk, and a lot of these paths are covered with stones, which are now rather old. So when you cycle over them, they rock, and it's like riding over a xylophone. If you cycle fast, you get this kind of rocking, percussive sound of stone, which can be very musical.
When speaking of a city's soundscape, it often seems that we are referring to a single sound, all the activity of the metropolis combined into an acoustic whole that, however complex, still represents the city's unique sonic character. As the diversity and the uniqueness of the previous examples point out, this is not what we hear in practice. Cities are just too large for our ears to register the entire soundscape as one. What we actually experience are specific environmental sounds that are connected to a very particular location. For this, Cusack coined the concept of the sonic place.
For me, a sonic place is all that you can hear at any one location. And clearly, if you move locations, then the sonic place moves with you. You carry your ears around with you. And although you can say, if you're standing or sitting in that place, you hear the soundscape, which of course is true, that soundscape is the sonic place. If you move 50 meters, then you will hear a similar but different soundscape. That's a different sonic place.
Put differently, the city's innumerable sonic places are the building blocks of the urban soundscape as a whole. As such, sonic places imply a great amount of detail. They are determined by a constant interplay between their physical environment, buildings, streets, walls, vegetation, and the sounds that are created by people and their noisy technologies. But also, even in the most urbanized of spaces, by natural elements like wind or rain and other living species. In fact, as the various editions of the Favorite Sounds project pointed out, these natural and wildlife sounds to a high degree influence the perceived quality of an urban sonic place.
Many people would say the sounds of wildlife, and they would often name a particular bird or animal, was their favourite sound of the city. I would say if you take the complete list of the favourite sounds of London or Berlin, it divides around 40% in people saying sounds of green spaces, and many of those are wildlife sounds. 40% talk about public transport sounds, and the other 20% are just everything else.
In the context of urban wildlife sound, the German city of Berlin makes for a remarkable example.
I moved to Berlin about 10 years ago now, and one of the big advantages for me in doing that was I could compare Berlin and London, those are the cities where I've spent most time in my life. Berlin is a much quieter city than London, generally. And it's also greener in the sense that there are far more green spaces per square kilometre in Berlin than there are in London. So the amount of wildlife in Berlin is quite big. The other thing that's interesting about Berlin is that it's actually quite an isolated city. The next big city from Berlin is a long way away, hundreds of kilometres. And it's surrounded by quite rural landscape, and Berlin itself is surrounded by forests, essentially. So it is a kind of island of urban city humanity in a much more rural area. Quite an interesting situation. It means that birds and animals or wildlife is constantly coming into Berlin from the outside. So the link between city and, or rather the human and the non-human in Berlin is very clear. It's in some ways quite integrated. There's also a lot of water in Berlin, many lakes and the River Spree and canals. Those are very good at attracting wildlife as well. So there's a constant interplay. And that, of course, affects the soundscape. Berlin is also a nightingale capital of the world, I would say. You hear nightingales, there are thousands of nightingales singing in Berlin during April and May. It's really a joy to listen to at night.
Berlin is also the city where Cusack, between 2011 and 2012, was an artist in residence at DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service. During this period, he initiated the Berlin Sonic Places project that took place from January to September 2012. The project brought together perspectives of various interest groups in a wide-ranging dialogue on the city's changing soundscape. Important overall themes were defining criteria for desirable sonic places, as well as exploring the role that city planners and developers could play in realizing these.
Actually, if you want to make a difference to the soundscape of a place, I don't think you can do it on your own. You need to make common ground with other people who are interested in the environment from different points of view. It was a collaborative project. It was set up as a collaborative project. So it involved other sound artists, students studying sound studies in Berlin, architects, planners, as many people as we could involve who had an input or an interest in Berlin soundscape from whatever angle, including normal people who lived there, were invited to discussions during the beginning of the Berlin Sonic Places project. That there were public events, public discussions, projects that students and sound artists did, and then public presentations of all that work. All that information is on the website. And subsequent to that, there's a book come out in 2017 called Berlin Sonic Places, which covers, a kind of more focused aspect of the original project, which was just the idea of a sonic place.
Okay. And could you give concrete examples maybe of how the Berlin Sonic Places project led to actual interventions in the city soundscape?
Well, I mean, my collaboration with urban planners is small, it has to be said. So whether what I've done has had any impact on them, I would doubt. But there are examples. For example, there was a very kind of much documented instance in Nauenerplatz in Berlin. Nauenerplatz is in North Berlin, Wedding, and 10, 15 years ago, it was not a nice place. There was kind of a drug scene there and substance abusers used to hang out. And the local people wanted, there was a playground there for kids, but the kids would not go there because it was too scary. So the city government said, okay, we need to make this work for kids and parents and the local people more. So they redesigned it all. And in doing so, they did a study of what people would like it to sound like. And they had local meetings. People were asked, what sounds would you like to hear in this place? And the answer was they would like to hear more birds and they would like to hear the sound of the sea. So this is Berlin, it's nowhere near the coast. How do you get the sound of the sea into Nauenerplatz? Or how, in those days, did you get birds into Nauenerplatz? Well, the answer in that case was to have what they built. They designed sonic benches and they would play recordings of these sounds through loudspeakers on the sonic benches. And that was built. All the children's playgrounds were redesigned and rebuilt. Well, in that particular Nauenerplatz, they actually made it. And if you go there today, the sonic benches still exist. However, in my opinion, at that point, they should have employed a sound artist to design the sounds that were playing through the loudspeakers. But they didn't. They just handed it over to somebody else, and they got a 15-second loop of birds singing from a forest outside Berlin. And it played back so loudly that people actually found it much too loud. They just didn't think properly of its impact in detail on people who would actually use the space.
Yes, and also from an ecological perspective, if one should want to hear birds in the city, wouldn't it be a better idea to plant some trees instead of building loudspeakers?
Exactly. So that's what it is. It's like urban landscaping. That's why I think it's very important for sound artists or anybody interested in sound, not just artists, to collaborate with urban landscape, because the right sonic solution in an urban landscape might be to plant a tree, not to bring any sound in specific. The tree will eventually bring some birds in and they will make the sound. That will be the right sonic solution.
A fine example of how important trees and vegetation are for a well-balanced urban soundscape is the Berlin neighborhood of Hummusbook. Up until the end of the DDR, it was an industrial and prison area where trees and wildlife had been left alone for decades. As a result, Hummusbook harbored one of the oldest existing narrow strips of trees in Berlin, just beside the Spree River, that was home to a spectacular variety of wildlife. In 2012, Hummusbook actually was one of the 3 main sites of interest in the Berlin Sonic Places project. As Peter Cusack pointed out in a 2016 interview in the Journal of Sonic Studies, the area was totally redeveloped to become a residential area. When the residents' houses were built, there were plans to cut down the trees to obtain a clearer view of the river. There was quite a lot of opposition from German nature conservation societies, however. When Cusack interviewed some of the people who lived there, many of them said they chose to go there precisely because of the natural surroundings. In the end, the trees weren't cut down. They're still there, harboring a stunning variety of bird life. Before meeting our second guest of this episode, let's take a listen to another project of Peter Cusack's. For Sounds from Dangerous Places, he traveled the world to sonically investigate places that are affected by heavy industry, military conflicts, or ecological damage.
Sounds from Dangerous Places is a project which investigates places of huge environmental change through sound. So if you think around the world, there are many places where big environmental changes have occurred. For example, where an oil field is built, it totally destroys what was there before and becomes an industrial site. You know, this is not necessarily the result of human action. They can be natural events as well. If an earthquake happens, it will devastate a whole area, or a tsunami, or a volcano. These huge events make massive environmental changes in their area, and also sometimes thousands of kilometers somewhere else from their area. Those changes affect many things, but certainly they affect the soundscape as well. So my question or my project is to do with how did this particular environmental change the soundscape? And by listening to the soundscape, how much information can you get about the change that has happened?
For Sounds from Dangerous Places, Cusack visited very specific locations, such as the Caspian oil fields in Azerbaijan and the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan, which is now being partially restored after virtually disappearing due to catastrophic water misuse. In 2006 and 2007, he also paid 2 visits to the Chernobyl exclusion zone.
And I was there for 4 days together with a Russian-speaking friend. And almost all the time we were recording. We visited villages, we visited the nuclear sites, we visited the places where the most intense fallout had happened. And we visited local people who still live there. That was one big surprise for me. I thought the exclusion zone meant there would be nobody living there. This is not true. Actually, quite a few people living there, always have been. And I met them and recorded them, their thoughts, even some of the songs they would sing. And in that way, my sonic picture of Chernobyl gave, again, a huge amount of more detail than I could read about in the Western media anyway. I mean, that was my source before I went.
In minutely communicating the atmosphere of these places, the field recordings Cusack made in Chernobyl belong to a practice that he calls sonic journalism.
I mean, sonic journalism isn't supposed to be a criticism of other forms of journalism. It's supposed to be an addition to them. Each of those different media, the writing or language, and the photographs or moving images, gives you a lot of information, but of a very specific to the medium. Sound is another medium and gives you another kind of information, and gives it in a different way, I would say. Sound is much more immersive, even when you're listening to recorded sound, is much more immersive than looking at images or reading a text or listening to a text. A sound recording can situate you in a place as an experience in a way that visual or text do not, I think. It's much stronger able to do that. It makes you feel what it might be like to be in such a place in a very direct way.
Case in point is a recording that was made about 1.5 kilometers from the reactor site, which still is a radioactive hotspot.
600. It was beside a village that had radio material dumped on it. There were no people living there at the time. It was an abandoned village, but the buildings were still there, and it got bad fallout. And the response to that was the village is now buried underground to prevent the radioactivity from being more dangerous. So what you see is grassy mounds, and underneath there are the remains of the village. So if you walk towards it holding a radiometer or a Geiger counter, the Geiger counter intensity that you can hear, or the number that it shows you on the screen, go up the closer you get to this particular place. But also in that recording, there's the sound of wind. One of the big questions about Chernobyl and any other nuclear disaster is what happens to the radioactivity that's been released. Where does it go? How does it move from one place to around the world? The radioactivity from Chernobyl can now be found anywhere in the world. And the question is, how does it distribute? Well, one of the main forces of distribution is wind. The radioactive fallout falls down to the ground and it gets incorporated in the dust of the soil, And when the wind blows, that dust blows with the wind and can blow hundreds, thousands of kilometres, which is what happened. And it ended up all over Europe. So the sound of the wind in that recording is a reminder or is a symbol of the mechanism which spreads radioactivity around the planet from its original location.
In the last two audio samples, we tacitly made quite a leap. In a single splice, we went from the radioactive outskirts of Chernobyl to the cozily snoring pet bunny of our second guest of this episode, the young Dutch sound artist Elise at Hart. With Hart's work, we complete a central trajectory in these first two episodes of Sounding Places, Listening Places, a movement from the outdoors to the indoors. In the first episode, we sonically explored the natural world in the work of Bernie Krause, Evelien van den Broek and Barry Truex. After focusing on the soundscape of the modern city with Peter Cusack, we conclude the second episode by listening to the environment that is probably the most familiar to us, our home. In 2013, the year in which she graduated from Utrecht School of the Arts, Elise at Hart initiated the Institute for Domestic Sound. Little did she know that the still ongoing project would develop into an extensive collection of sounds from our households. Think of squeaking floors, a bubbling coffee machine, buzzing refrigerators, a ticking clock, or the blaring radio of the neighbors. Looking back, at Hart's decision to work with sound was a remarkable one.
I studied fine arts, where I found myself among painters and sculptors. And after working with paint and brushes for some time, I began to feel more clearly that sound was my actual medium of choice. Sound is my way of telling stories, of taking people into my world. And undoubtedly, my background is of some influence here. So I come from a musical family. My parents are musicians, and two of my brothers went to the conservatory as well.
She clearly remembers a decisive experience that led her to work with sound, with domestic sounds in particular.
I was paying a visit to my grandmother, and my grandparents collected clocks. And while I was sitting on their couch, I thought, okay, if I listen to this sound again in 40, 50 years, I would instantly feel like I'm here again. I will be able to see them, to feel them, to smell them, just by hearing the sound of those ticking clocks. And that experience made me actually realize that the noise from our homes are much more important to us than we think. So for me, it felt like a natural step to start work with those sounds. Soon I started asking people for sounds that meant a lot to them, and in no time I received all kinds of beautiful examples and beautiful stories. It went from a whistling tea kettle to the crunching gravel in the driveway, or the creaking of a stair step that you carefully skipped as a teenager because otherwise your parents would wake up. And I started to collect and document these sounds by making audio recordings, and in short text I described the context in which I found them.
Over the past 8 years, at Hart has been presenting her archive in various installations, publications and performances, as well as on the radio. Her aim is to make her listeners more aware of their surrounding sounds and to foster a more complete experience of their environment. Let's listen to some special sounds from her archive. Do you recognize what you're listening to? an institute for domestic sound, but also a lockdown archive, to which we will listen in a short while. When looking at the titles of Hart's projects, one quickly notices that the documentation and conservation of sound are a central aspect of her work.
I think it's very important to preserve sounds for a later period in time, especially the ones that are about to disappear from our daily lives. I mean, from the moment that we were able to create images, we've been documenting what the world looks like in paintings, illustrations, pictures, sculptures. We can go back in centuries, if not millennia. And that possibility is lacking in sound, simply because our ability to record, it is relatively new. Still, soundscapes can give us so much information about our world, and I think it's extremely important to record that. 2 years ago, I did an artist in residence at the Meertens Institute, where I made a podcast. I delved into their so-called Dialectenbank, their dialect database. This is an archive of recorded conversations that provide insight into what Dutch language sounds like in different regions of the Netherlands, in different time periods. And although the actual emphasis is on the spoken language, I focused on the background sounds, on the ticking clocks, the noises of the pets, a rattling box of matches before lighting a cigarette. And these sounds we rarely hear now, but it provides a wealth of information about how people lived. So yes, I do think it's important to capture those sounds and archive them properly.
Nettief. Ja, ik weet niet precies wat hij daarmee bedoelde. Nee, dat steeds net
My favorite sound from this project? I think I would go for the ringing, clinging coffee and tea sets. Nowadays we serve our coffee in a mug, but back in the day porcelain cups were standard, complete with saucer and spoon. And to me that high-pitched ringing is a phenomenal sound. It's like it's an extremely cozy and hospitable sound. You know, the most striking domestic sounds are often the most common as well. These are sounds that surround us on daily basis. They form the soundtrack to our daily life. And often they are so familiar to us that we hardly hear them anymore, until they are missing, for instance, after a move to a new house. If your doorbell suddenly rings different, or you hear a sound that you cannot place, this certainly has an impact on you. It becomes clear how enormously important sounds are to feel safe or at home somewhere.
An interesting question is how sound is able to give us such an intimate sense of home and homeliness. The Swiss sonic theorist Salomé Vauquelin offers the beginning of an answer in her book Listening to Noise and Silence. According to Vauquelin, our senses are always already ideologically and aesthetically determined. In other words, they bring their own influence to our perception. Vision, for example, by its very nature assumes a distance, she writes. Seeing always happens in a metaposition, away from the scene, however close. This distance enables a certain detachment and objectivity. After all, seeing is believing, as the proverb goes. Our listening sense, however, does not offer such a metaposition. Vauquelin continues, "There is no place where I am not simultaneous with the heard. However far its source, the sound sits in my ear. I cannot hear it if I am not immersed in its auditory object." To listen means to focus our attention on our sonic environment, but at the same time, this sonic environment focuses itself back on us. Sound waves find their way through the ear canal, via the eardrum into the inner ear. They seek out the resonance frequencies of our skull, our sinuses, and let our intestines vibrate sympathetically. Listening, in other words, is an emphatically embodied way of engaging with the world. It allows us to physically share time and space with the place that is our home.
This reminds me a lot of Mary Shaver, who in The Tuning of the World writes that hearing is a way of touching at a distance. And I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. We are touched by sound, physically, by means of air pressure, sound waves, but emotionally as well. At the same time, however, Shaver writes about how our Western culture is primarily visually orientated. We are very focused on what we see, like on screens of our computers, smartphones, in TV commercials, shopping windows. And it's also very evident from our language. Think of words like eye-opener.
As some kind of counter-reaction to this visual dominance, Hart notices a recent revaluation of listening.
I mean, I don't think it is a coincidence that we're doing this interview for a podcast, which has become a very popular medium in the past decade. The same goes for audiobooks, or these called ASMR movies on YouTube, full of rustling bits of paper and ticking nails. Yeah, I feel like people take the time to really listen to things.
Another recent example of how our listening has seemed to intensify occurred during the first corona lockdown in the spring of 2020.
Remember the amazement that so many people felt when the cities felt silent? Just read the newspapers of last spring. So much has been written about the sudden silence, about the disappearance of noise and the fact that people were able to hear the natural soundscape again. People really started to listen differently at their environment, to their city, their street, but also to their home.
The fact that people were confined to their homes during the corona pandemic inspired Hart to a new project, her lockdown archive.
I immediately thought this is the chance to ask people what they hear in their homes now that they're spending so much time inside. What sounds stand out? What new sounds did they hear? Did they find it pleasant or very annoying? So I simply placed a call, and then people started sending me their domestic sounds. The entries were extremely diverse, from the sounds of working from home and homeschooling to a neighbor sweeping the sidewalk, sounds of pets and people playing piano again. I also received a lot of sanding machines and high-pressure cleaners because I think lots of people started doing odd jobs or renovating the garden.
One of the most striking and symbolic recordings that Hart received was the sound of an electronic soap dispenser, used to disinfect the hands after a quick visit to the grocery store. When listening on Hart's SoundCloud page to recordings of both the Institute for Domestic Sound and the Lockdown Archive, I was struck by the amount of natural sounds that I came across. Apart from traffic noises, rattling washing machines and buzzing smartphones, I hear birdsong in early spring. The far-off bells of grazing cows. And the murmuring of waves as heard from a seaside vacation rental.
It is true. I often receive nature sounds, singing blackbirds, the wind blowing in a tree, sounds of the waterfront, and strangely enough, rain showers also do well. In general, people really don't like rain, but we seem to love the sound of a heavy shower. I think it has to do with a wish for connection with the world around us. In the past year, everyone was forced to spend a lot of time at home. We not only saw the walls coming toward us, but we heard them too. And after a while, people start to get annoyed by the sound of their neighbors or the children or even the sounds of themselves. And it's precisely then that outdoor sounds can give a feeling of space and liberation. These sounds remind us that the world is bigger than just the few square meters of your living space.
Thank you so much for listening to Sounding Places, Listening Places, a Radio ArtEZ podcast series in which we explore the relationship between sound and our environment. In this second episode, we have been focusing on the soundscapes of our cities and our homes. In the next, Sharon Stewart will speak about themes of land, sound and ownership with the German-Australian geographer and sound artist Amerikan Gieser and American vocalist, composer and interdisciplinary artist Lisa E. Harris. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our many episodes on deep listening, in which Sharon explores the life work of composer, musician, writer and humanitarian Pauline Oliveros. Sounding Places, Listening Places was commissioned by ArtEZ Studium Generale. Interviews, texts and voiceovers by Sharon Stewart and myself, Joep Christenhusz. Editing and sound production by Dennis Gaans of Onderkast. I hope to see you again in our next episode.